Okay, I guess it's time to appear. Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
All right. So, LD. Yeah.
Great. That's awesome.
Congrats on making it past the break, folks.
Thank you. All right, great. If we're all ready, we can go ahead and get started.
When you're ready, go ahead.
Great.
Can we run introductions really quick?
Sure. My name is Masako Orlando, and I'll be your affirmative speaker for this round. Thank you so much for judging.
Great. Thank you.
And my name's Luke Castle. I'll be negating the resolution. Thanks for taking your time. I know it's an inconvenience, and we really appreciate it.
Okay. Appreciate you both.
Sure,
Hi, I'm Dr. Ups.
Hi. So before we start this round, I think it'd be beneficial for both sides if we were to ask you your judging experience before this round.
Sure. Yeah, I was a college debater ages ago. I taught debate and taught research writing for years. I'm definitely looking in terms of judging philosophy. I'm fine with basic debate gamesmanship, but given the nature of this kind of debate, a couple things. One, your tournament, your league uses a lot of lay judges, which means that yeah, I'll smell test evidence. I don't like a lot of judge intervention, but if if you try to run something past me that just doesn't make the smell test, then yeah, okay, I'll drop it. The other thing is, what I'm looking for is a sense of the proportion of the evidence to the impact you want to have on the argument. So just make sure that when you bring in something that the evidence of the argument, that it'll actually get us there. Good, well-warranted evidence. Aside from that, I'm very open to how you run things. You all are, I imagine, pretty comfortable with managing your time. And so while I will be timing, basically, I'm going to assume we're all operating in good faith here. So if you will let me know if you have any questions or problems as we go, we'll try to make it work.
Okay, great. Right, so if everyone's ready.
Go. I'm ready when you are. Go right ahead.
All right, 6 minutes on the clock. Timer starting now. Quote, "A country without a patent office and good patent laws is just like a crab, and it couldn't travel anyway but sideways or backwards." Mark Twain. I agree with Mark Twain. That's because I agree with him that I, as the affirmative side, stand resolved. Protection of intellectual property ought to be valued above open source innovation. But first, before we start this round, let's define some things just so we're all on the same page with what we're debating today. The first definition you can write down as protection of intellectual property. For the United States International Trade Commission, quote, "Intellectual property, IP, refers to creations of the mind, inventions, literary and artistic works and symbols, images, names, and logos used in commerce." End quote. For clarity, I'll abbreviate intellectual property and protection of intellectual property to IP and PIP throughout my case, respectively. The second definition you can write down as open source innovation. Quote, "Open to public participation as in the sharing of information," end quote. Now, how do we weigh the two sides? The value that I propose for weighing this round is general welfare. It's defined as the health, peace, morality, and safety of a person. So when we're talking about general welfare, we're referring to a person's well-being and quality of life. So, Judge, if voting for protection of intellectual property means that we can promote general welfare, that should warrant an affirmative ballot. But why should you judge this round on general welfare? You can tag my value link as intrinsically good. General welfare is how we can determine whether something is benefiting us. And as a society, we should be looking at how we improve our general welfare. Protection of intellectual property and open source innovation play a key role in our general welfare because they affect aspects of our lives like protection of property, innovation that benefits mankind, and promoting the economy. So that's why we should be using this value in this round. Let's move on to my first contention. Protection of intellectual property promotes general welfare. The first subpoint you can write under this is helps our everyday lives. World Intellectual Property Foundation explains 3 reasons why intellectual property is so good. First, the progress and well-being of humanity rests on its capacity to create and invent new works. Second, the legal protection of new creations invents the commitment of additional resources for further innovation. And third, the promotion and protection of intellectual property spurs economic growth, creates jobs and industries, and enhances the quality of life and enjoyment in life. Lastly, it states that IP protection is enabling us as a society to make sure that we keep innovating. Let's look at a couple of examples where we can see that protection of intellectual property helps our everyday lives. Take cars, for instance. Their designs inside and out, motors, engines, dashboards, and other parts are all examples of protected IP. The Toyota Prius hybrid car alone has 2,000 plus patents. Improved crops, food products, drugs, medical procedures and devices, contact lenses, airplanes, cell phones, sound systems, televisions, appliances, books, music, and movies are other examples of intellectual property. Items that we can't live without or would miss terribly. IP protection ensures they stay around. Protection of intellectual property is vital in how we function and flourish in this world. Protection of intellectual property protects and promotes innovation. You can write down the impact as pre-IP promotes innovation, which promotes general welfare. My second subpoint you can write down as promotes economic growth. Quote, intellectual property protection is important for emerging economies because it helps the creation of new knowledge, broad sharing of knowledge, and promotes economic growth. Studies has also shown that copyrighted industries make economic developments in developing countries as well as developed countries. We all truly depend on a successful economy to provide the money that we need for the safety we need, which improves our well-being. You can write down the impact as PIP promotes economic growth. Let's move on to my second contention. Open source innovation harms general welfare. The reason why we have intellectual property is to incentivize the creation of new things. With open source innovation, we have absolutely none of that. Let's look at 2 ways how open source innovation does not help general welfare. My first subpoint you can write down as no innovation. Quick, think of an open source product that's innovative. If you said Linux, you failed the test. Linux is essentially a copy of another operating system called Unix. Making a copy of an already existing product, no one I know would call that innovation. When Christoph Chernowitz, a management professor at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, analyzed the 500 top open source projects from SourceForge.net, he found that only 5 of the 500, 1%, were examples of radical innovation. This means that open source innovation is not driving innovation that benefits our general welfare. Protection of intellectual property is. The impact you can write down is open source innovation does not promote general welfare. You can write down my second subpoint as disincentivizing creativity. Quote, ruthless copying can disincentivize creativity. Why pour money and energy into a new product that your competitor is going to steal the moment you unveil it? Companies that get hooked on stealing can inadvertently sap their own ability to come up with new ideas, end quote. Not valuing intellectual property has the detrimental effect of disincentivizing creativity, which reduces opportunities for open source innovation to benefit the general welfare. You can write down the impact as OSI fails general welfare. It's for these reasons, Judge, that when we look at how protection of intellectual property promotes general welfare, why I strongly urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you, and I now stand ready for cross-examination.
All right. Good use of time. CX, we are ready?
Yes, I am.
All righty. 3 minutes.
3 minutes, if you're ready, Misaka?
Sure.
All right. Do you think life is important?
Sure.
Would you agree it's a foundational right?
Yes, that's an aspect of general welfare.
Okay. Do you think it's more important to value fundamental rights or things like economic concerns?
We should be valuing people's individual rights or people's right to their life first, and then we can be valuing other aspects of their general welfare.
Okay, and specifically looking within general welfare, can we agree we should prioritize the protection of life above the protection of financial gain?
Sure.
Okay, so we're going to focus on life first. Great.
Sure.
Most companies give away stuff for free if they have the ability to make money from it.
I mean, that's debatable, especially in which industry we're talking about. A lot of different companies send out freebies a lot to promote their brand.
Okay, but we can agree in general terms, if people have the ability to make a lot of money from something, they'll probably make money from it instead of giving it away.
Yes, they'll probably make money off of it.
All right, great. Would you support me violating one person's property rights in order to save 100 lives?
That really depends. When we're talking on individual rights, we should be focusing on that person's rights. It can be a choice for them to share the information to save those lives, but it's really up to that one person.
Okay, so you would not support one person losing an idea to say.
I support one person devaluing their own IP to help the lives of other people. I do not support forcing someone to do something regardless of what it is.
Okay, but in that instance, you would support that person choosing not to use their intellectual property.
I would support that person, but I would not force that person.
But you would support an intellectual property violation.
I support their choice to do whatever they want to do with their own property.
You support their choice to violate their own IP.
Yes.
Okay. Now, moving into the idea of your first contention, you brought up the application of cars. Was there any specific evidence that Toyota has a lot of patents?
Yes, and I talked about how Toyota has 200 plus patents. This is from Eric Classen, who's professor of entrepreneurship at Amsterdam Free University.
All right, and we can agree that all car companies aren't literally the same, correct?
No, but a lot of major car companies do have patents on their cars.
All right, we talked about how Linux wasn't very innovative. Can we agree Linux alone being non-innovative doesn't mean open source innovation doesn't work?
I'm sorry, can you repeat your first part of that question? Your mic was cutting out.
Sure, you talked a lot about Linux and how they don't actually innovate anything. Can we agree just because one person who claims to be open source isn't very innovative doesn't mean the entirety of the industry isn't innovative?
Sure, but when we look at the whole entire industry, a lot of the industry is just copying, not actually being innovative and using open source innovation.
All right. And can we agree that if you have to compete with someone, then you typically have lower prices and better quality?
Sure.
Okay, so then encouraging some type of competition, as in multiple people creating the same thing, drives up quality for consumers.
Which is exactly what protection of intellectual property does.
All right, and you brought up this whole idea about how it promotes economic growth. Did you have any specific evidence for that?
Sure. So it's just the basic understanding of economics that when you create new products or innovate on those products, that will spur the GDP rate, which in turn grows economics.
Misako, did you have a specific piece of evidence?
It's just logic when you look at economic theory. I do have evidence though to show that economic growth is brought on by protection of intellectual property. I can send that to you.
Please do.
Sure.
Over 3 minutes of preparation time. I'll take a bit now.
All right.
Setting timer and starting. I'm going to stop my prep time at 1 minute and 50 seconds.
Looks right.
Shift some papers around here. Got 7 minutes on the clock for the negative constructive if y'all are ready. All right, I'll go ahead and begin.
Take it away.
All right, setting time for 7 minutes. When I was 13, I witnessed the death of a close friend's mom. Her disease was so rare that there was no cure, and for 6 weeks, I saw her children suffer through the fact that she was there and technically living, but would never be cured. Watching anyone go through a circumstance where their family member, mother, father, or grandparent dies because there's no cure is absolutely tragic, especially when you're watching a 6-year-old. But it's a situation that intellectual property is forcing upon 30 million people every single year. And it's because I don't think that making money at the cost of millions of lives is even remotely morally acceptable that I reject our resolution and stand resolved protection of intellectual property should not be valued above open source innovation. Now, for starters, I accept both definitions that my opponent presented. I do accept the value they've presented, but I want you to write something down. Focus, life. Now, the whole idea of having this it's a very good idea. General welfare, yeah, sure, it's a great thing. But in cross-examination, my opponent specified the fact that we need to look at life before economic concerns. I want you to remember that. If she can't prove to you that it's upholding life, it doesn't matter how many economic concerns it promotes out of her own mouth. Impact, life first. I want you to ignore all of her economic arguments until she can prove that open source innovation isn't directly harming life. Now, you might be thinking, is this even related to life in the slightest? I'm going to have two contentions of my own, illustrating how the idea of intellectual property directly kills millions while open source innovation promotes overall welfare. Starting with contention number 1, go ahead and write it down as protecting IP, or PIP, harms general welfare. Now, in an article published by the National Institute of Health, E. Richard Gold, Warren Kaplan, James Zabrowski, Sarah Hargan Logan, and Nabil Morandi wrote on January 5th of 2010, quote, the patent system, not just patent rights, but how they're obtained and used, has resulted in an innovation system characterized by a dramatic increase in healthcare costs and decreasing quality and levels of innovation, end quote. That's a wordy quote. What it's saying is that through multiple National Institute of Health studies, they have found the idea of intellectual property decreases quality and innovation within the medical industry. In fact, it is actively blocking people from being able to access cures they need. Let me break down how in 2 real-world applications. First, Pfizer's Alzheimer's. Now, I don't know if you know anyone with Alzheimer's, but I can tell you from personal experience, watching someone lose their minds is one of the hardest things I've ever been to. Rebecca Clark, writing for The Hill on June 5th of 2019, says, quote, a U.S. drug company did not openly share or perform further studies on a successful rheumatoid arthritis medicine that internal researchers found was reducing the risk of Alzheimer's disease by 64%, end quote. Now, she's talking about a company called Pfizer, and she's interviewing a couple scientists. Basically, what happened is the internal researchers found out there was a double use for one of their drugs. Doctors found out and were thrilled. 64% of their largest industry, the people with Alzheimer's, could get their minds and their lives back. So they went to Pfizer and said, will you please test it so we can start prescribing it? And they said no. That would cost $80 million. The doctor's like, if we can get the money together, can someone else test it so we can feasibly give this out to other people? Pfizer said no. That would require us giving up intellectual property. We'd rather watch the 28 million people die. Millions are killed because intellectual property creates a barrier that keeps Pfizer from releasing that information. A cure is locked up and 28 million people are paying the cost. And that's not even an isolated incident. Here's my second application, EpiPens. Now, if you have a severe allergy, carrying an EpiPen is probably the difference between life and death. Mylar patented them back in 1999. But according to Ryan Whitman, writing for Extreme Tech in October of 2016, Mylan takes full advantage that no one can copy the pen, because in 2008, they raised the cost from $100 to $600. Now, according to Charlie McRae, writing for the Washington Post in 2016, the number of ER visits due to allergies has doubled since EpiPen's price ups became a thing. Here's what I want you to remember. The affirmative speaker will come up here and talk a lot about their favorite economicists and applications, pointing to the benefits of innovation and economic gain. And I don't care. Because protecting these ideas means we have to watch 30 million people die every single year. That's not acceptable. Here's a better option. Contention number 2, upholding open source innovation promotes general welfare. Now, Alexander Schuster, Oliver Glassman, Nigel McCracken, and Marcus Hender, writing for the Journal of Translational Medicine on May 8th of 2018, write, quote, open sourcing in the pharma sector is being used to make drug development for neglected diseases feasible, thus ensuring affordable drugs for those who need them, end quote. Now, the same article references multiple organizations who have created over 500,000 cures based purely on open source innovation. Here's a real-world example. Application number 3, polio vaccine. According to NPR, in 1952, there was a major disease called polio. Now, it either killed or took away the legs of 58,000 children. So in 1955, a man named Dr. Salk decided to address the problem. He did so through open source innovation. And on April 12th, 1955, he officially refused to patent the product. He saved millions of children, and he said he would rather not be rich. He would rather let people take the idea and make it so that children could get it and he could watch them walk. If we want to promote general welfare, we have to stop the idea of keeping our drugs secret and making money at the cost of other people's lives. My opponent said lives is more important than economic gain in the value of general welfare. Therefore, this debate round is going negative. Let's quickly refute a couple of my opponent's arguments. She brought up the idea of protection of intellectual property promotes general welfare. My response to the first subpoint and her first application is that, or pretty much my response to her entire first contention is creates a barrier. Maybe it does allow us to create more money, but as my opponent Green CX, that doesn't matter. It lets us make money, great, but it's killing 30 million people. Next, she brought me the idea of how it's promoting economic growth. Two responses. One, less important. My opponent conceded this isn't as important. Secondly, non-specific. Her evidence just says related industries. That is not a specific piece of evidence, and that growth is not specifically related to intellectual property. Next, she talked about how there's no innovation within the idea of open source innovation. Two responses. One, OpenMRS. OpenMRS stopped Ebola with a computer program and a drug they made, stopping a pandemic with 111 volunteers in open source innovation. Second response, is that a fallacy? Simply saying because Linux doesn't innovate, nothing in open source innovation can innovate is a bad idea. So maybe one company who claims the label doesn't do it. That hardly condemns the entire concept. In response, the idea of dismisses creativity, encourages quality. Having multiple people make the same thing and people always taking each other's ideas allows quality to be increased and allows us to get our ideas out to the world. Here's what it comes down to. We have to uphold life to protect general welfare, and open source innovation is how we do that.
All right.
All right, if everyone's ready.
Ready for CX? Let's do
All
it.
right, great. 3 minutes on the clock. Let's start now. All right, so talking about your first contention of Pfizer, what was the source of that article?
That article came from Rebecca Clare, The Washington Post, and Alzheimer's News Today.
Sure, and who are they?
Rebecca Clare, The Washington Post, and Alzheimer's News Today.
I'm asking, like, what are their credentials?
Oh, Rebecca Clare has a PhD. Alzheimer's News Today.
A PhD in what?
I'm sorry, I don't have the specifics off my head. Alzheimer's News Today is the largest Alzheimer's research group in America.
I'm just asking about the first lady. Great. Let's move down to your second contention. Talking about MRS. So you said they had a computer program and they created a new medicine. So what was that computer program based off of?
I'm not specifically sure. I know that it was a totally new system that they had to create a new server to run.
Okay, so what totally new system is this? What sort of coding did they use for their
I'm not an engineer, but I do know my quote directly says that they created a new server and a totally new program. I can get you more specifics on that.
Okay, so yeah, sure, I'd love those specifics. Let's talk about, let's move back up to the EpiPen. So is that specific to the EpiPen or specific to the ingredients in the EpiPen?
They specifically patented not only the ingredients can only be injected through an automatic injection. So it is
okay, through the automatic injection. So is the automatic injection the one that was patented?
Right. The problem is that specific drug can only be taken through an automatic injection.
Okay, so if someone were to create a completely different type of automatic injection, that solves the problem of having too expensive EpiPens, correct?
Unfortunately, they patented the entire idea of an auto injector. So no.
Okay, so they did. Can you provide that source in the chat, please?
I'm sure when we finish prep.
Okay, great. Let's move down to your polio vaccine. So he chose not to patent his vaccine, correct?
Yes, he chose not to.
Okay, did he share that information?
Yep, he gave it to every drug company.
Okay, and how were they able to create those drugs?
I'm not specifically sure. I'm assuming they went and mixed up the ingredients, but they might have used magic.
Okay. Thank you, Luke. Let's talk about your creating a barrier. So what is that barrier?
The barrier is the fact that intellectual property stops testing and stops distribution, costing 30 million lives every single year.
Okay, so it stops distribution. So by someone having a patent, they're no longer selling any of their medication?
Well, in these specific instances, no. Intellectual property is directly tracked back to, once again, 30 million lives deaths a year.
Okay, so 30 million lives are lost because of protection of intellectual property.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, can you provide that source, please?
Sure, that's a logical conclusion from the fact that we're losing 28 million here and thousands a year from here.
Okay, so it's a logical conclusion, but you don't have proof that protection of intellectual property has been directly causing the death of thousands of millions of people.
I disagree. I have evidence right here that it's causing the death of about 28,000, and then we have evidence that it's costing 7 more thousand.
Again, so you have specific evidence on that. Can you please provide that specific evidence?
The same pieces I'll be sending during prep, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
Affirmative starting 3 minutes of prep time.
Seconds to dig those out of my research brief.
That's fine. 3 minutes of prep time. Timer starting now. Hey, Luke, I don't have Washington Post, so I can't actually access any of those articles that you're sending to me.
If you use the incognito mode on Chrome, you'll be able to access it.
Okay, great. I'm stopping prep time. 1 minute and 7 seconds remaining. 1, 7. That's right here.
Yeah, the WAPO's paywall is a pain.
Man, it's such a barrier.
for all of us.
Yeah, if you go through incognito mode, it'll allow you to access it. I don't have it.
Note to self: no comments on WAPO's paywall will be included as arguments in this round.
Gosh, I need to check my sources now. All right, everyone's ready?
Oh,
All right, if everyone's ready.
I'm good when you all are.
All right, great. 4 minutes on the clock. Timer starting now.
Great.
All right, Judge. So in this first affirmative rebuttal, I'm going to be going on the flow, giving some direct refutation to what Luke just said in his speech, as well as some additional clarifications, just so we're all on the same page with the affirmative viewpoint, as well as what we're debating in this resolution. First thing I want to talk about is my opponent's argument of focusing on life. I have a couple responses to this. You can take my first response as no reason to limit. The value of general welfare focuses on people's lives. That's a given in the definition of a general welfare. So we should be able to focus on other aspects, because protection of intellectual property as well as open source innovation don't only affect whether you live or die. They also affect aspects of how safe or how healthy or how happy you are as a person. So there's no reason to limit. However, you can tag my second response as empirically proven. It's empirically proven, and I'll talk about that as I go on to my speech, that protection of intellectual property does save the lives of millions of people through protecting the patents and also through creating safer medications for people to take. Which leads me to my response to my opponent's first contention of protecting protection of intellectual property harms. You can tag my first response, subpoint A, as investors. Fred Roedner, who's a German health economist, says that the process to create a new medicine takes 2 billion euros, which is around $233 million. He goes on to say later that they conducted a study, and what he found is that investors only want to invest in those in creating new medications or creating new products if their money was going to be protected. So we can actually see that protection of intellectual property, this study was based on protection of intellectual property, actually incentivizes investors to invest money. Which leads me to subpoint C of medical advancement. Currently, this is an article based on how patented medicines improve the world. There are 7,000 new medicines currently in development, over 1,800 oncology, 1,400 neurological disorder medications, 1,200 medicines. You don't have to write all these numbers, but the real impact is that protection of intellectual property is what fuels the medical field. Which leads me to my third response. You can tag my third response as safety regulations. Drug product patents refer to a particular state in which the medicine is delivered to the patient, such as formulation or dosage use. So as a result, these innovations may lead to improved health outcomes and reduced hospitalizations. The impact of all three of these arguments is that protection of intellectual property promote the general welfare. In response to my opponent's argument of Pfizer and their Alzheimer's, I have a couple responses. You can tag my first response as insurance claims. Insurance claims. What they actually found when they were looking at insurance claims are not a great indicator to know whether they should conduct a whole blown out medical research system. So we can see that the actual impact that my opponent was not bringing up was that when they found this information was in insurance claims, not something that scientists found or they found this magical information when they were conducting experiments. This is not at all what what the argument of Pfizer is. In response to my opponent's argument of EpiPens, you can tag my response as generic brands. Judge, before EpiPens were created, people would just have regular injectors to inject themselves with insulin. So it's completely absurd to say that the EpiPens, how they're so expensive, is going to stop people from getting insulin, because they can just use normal or regular injectors as they did before the invention of the EpiPen. Impact disregard. In response to my opponent's second contention on how open source innovation promotes growth, you can tag my response as the negative has no industry. Judge, I want to bring up that I said in my first subpoint of, in response to my opponent's first contention, investors only want to invest in products that they know will be protecting their money. The impact is the negative has no investors and no money to actually create those products. Which leads me down to my opponent's argument of polio vaccine. We can actually see that there was no real innovation as he just shared this sort of information, and he didn't provide any evidence to show that they were innovating off of the original polio vaccine. The impact is it's not open source innovation. In response to my opponent's argument of creates a barrier, there is no barrier. In fact, protection of intellectual property saves the lives of millions of people worldwide. And in response to my opponent's argument of specific, that was provided in my second card showing the development and non-developed countries. Thank you.
I have 1 minute, 50 seconds of prep remaining. I'll take a bit now.
Okay.
All right, stopping prep time now. 6 minutes on the clock for the negative rebuttal. If y'all are ready.
Go.
Okay, let's begin. Now, in the final negative speech of today's debate round, I want to point out the fact that there's really 3 arguments that are deciding who you vote for today. First, your stance on focusing on life. Now, this is pretty obvious because my opponent conceded it in cross-sects, but we'll clarify it anyway. Next, whether or not intellectual property harms life, which should be evident by the National Institute of Health and the applications, but we'll deal with those in a second. And finally, whether or not open source innovation promotes it, which should be obviously empirically correct, as well as the Journal of Translational Medicine. But once again, we'll deal with those in the voting issues. Let's start by cleaning up the flow a little bit, looking at some of my opponent's fallacies and saying why we'll be able to address those. She first talked about the no reason to limit. My response is CX admission. And cross-examination, I asked if we should prioritize life over economic concerns, and she said yes. I have a great reason to limit. It's because my opponent told me to in cross-sects. Next, she talked about empirically proven. I'm just going to be dealing with this point as we look at our other issues, since there was no rhetoric underneath this. Now, next, she brought the idea of medical investments, and she also talked about investors. They're the same point, so I have one response, mostly government. According to the National Institute of Health, almost 90% of our current funding comes from governmental grants. So sure, investors are a problem, but the government's going to continue to give them a majority of their money. Impact, no concern. These don't come from private investors. She's looking at Europe, not the United States. Most governments, according to the National Institute of Health, fund the majority of their medical innovation. And since the main ones happen in the United States, most of our medical innovation will be untouched. Now, responding to the idea of safety regulation, non-unique. It's not like we're going to throw the FDA out the window if we start using open source. That's totally illogical. The Federal Drug Administration will continue to look over our concerns and continue to make sure that drugs are safe. Next, she talked about insurance claim. My response is internal researchers. The evidence I presented said internal researchers found that this was the state. So I'm not really sure where she's getting insurance claims from, since that's directly against my warrant. Next, she brought up the idea about generic brands. My response is limited. According to the Extreme Temp article, and specifically according to Charlie McRae in the Washington Post, this wouldn't be an issue if, more people wouldn't be dying if there was generic brands. There's a reason we've seen an increase in allergy costs. It's because EpiPens has a complete monopoly. That makes no logical sense in our debate round. She talked about how the neg has no industry. My response is empirically wrong. Let me bring up another application. Have you heard of OpenMRS? It's the very thing that stopped Ebola, creating a drug and a computer program with no specific private funding, just a little bit of government funding and volunteer hours. It stopped a pandemic. It has been this idea of we have no industry and that we can't get anything done is empirically wrong, since I brought up multiple applications of it working in the real world. So she talked about there's no innovation. My response is that of open source groups. There's plenty of innovation. Open source get together, they innovate together. This is not a problem. She can't empirically convince me this is true. She talked about how there's no barrier. My response is can't access. Pfizer currently won't let 30 million people who need the drug access it because they want to protect their intellectual property. Now, call me crazy, but that sounds like a barrier. She then talked about how her evidence is actually fine. My response is evidence doesn't show. I encourage you to look at the link that she sent. It says intellectual property related industries. That is hardly the same thing, and therefore this evidence should be thrown out as it's not specific to our debate. I do want to point out she dropped the initial time I brought up OpenMRS, the fallacy of her second contention, and the fact that it encourages quality. Since this is my last speech, I'm asking you flow those three arguments over to the negative side of the debate round. Let's take a step back and focus on the 3 points that are the winner and loser of this debate. If I win one of the following 3 issues, that's enough of a reason to cast a negative ballot. Here's my first one. Focus on life. This is really easy because I'm sure you were listening during cross-examination when my opponent said prioritize life over economic concerns. My opponent conceded this, and it makes logical sense. It's the moral thing to do. Focus on whether or not life is protected or lost, not the other way around. Impact, life, primary concern. Unless my opponent can prove to you that intellectual property upholds life and open source innovation doesn't uphold it, then she's losing this debate round. So let's break that into 2 more voting issues and break down why intellectual property harms it and why open source innovation promotes it. Voting issue number 2, intellectual property or IP destroys. Now, I brought up some applications, and my opponent didn't really have great responses to those, or at least not responses that were worked with the evidence or had any warrant behind them. So those applications are still on the table. But beyond that, she completely refused to address my arguments from the National Institute of Health, saying that intellectual property is creating barriers, decreasing levels of innovation, and decreasing quality. She hasn't been able to respond from our government's National Institute, talking about how bad intellectual property is for the medical industry. Impact, intellectual property harms. My opponent's not going to be able to convince us that something is completely false. She's good, but she can't convince us that limiting ideas is going to save lives. My third and final voting issue you can write down as open source innovation promotes. Now, I've brought up multiple applications like polio vaccine, which she wasn't really able to respond to, the idea of OpenMRS, which we haven't heard any response to at all, as well as articles from the National Institute of Health and the Journey of Transitional Medicine. She hasn't been able to convince us that taking ideas and giving them to people doesn't promote their overall life. Here's how it works. Intellectual property in the case of Pfizer is keeping 28 million people out. Open source in the case of the polio vaccine is giving the idea away so that life can be promoted and ultimately uphold the general welfare. Let's take a step back and take a look at your flowpad. Now, there's going to be another speech, but Misaka's an ethical debater, so she won't present any new arguments. Every argument you get to vote for is already on your flow, and they all say the same thing. Intellectual property destroys the type of general welfare the affirmative agreed to prioritize, while open source innovation fulfills the burden agreed upon by the affirmative and negative team and upholds life. Remember, we uphold general welfare by focusing on life. IP destroys it, while open source innovation promotes it. Vote next.
One minute and 7 seconds of affirmative prep time starting now.
You've got it.
If everyone's ready.
Go right ahead.
All right, great. Let's get started. Judge, in this last affirmative speech, I'm going to be going in the flow, responding to Luke's arguments, and then providing my own voting issues on why ultimately, Judge, what you're writing down your flow flows in the direction of the affirmative side. First argument my opponent brought up was that mostly government subsidized. However, you can tag my response as investors. See, Judge, the source that I brought up was from Fred Roedner, who's a German health economist. So he took a study of investors. Now, what does this mean? Is that investors are the ones that are investing in companies. There isn't really any real proof to show that only governments are what's subsidizing or that are providing money for projects. In response to my opponent's argument of non-unique and safety regulations, you can tag my response as safety regulations are patents. So devaluation of those patents will be a devaluation of safety regulations. Again, I provided drug administration patents are patents. So when we devalue that, there won't be as much safety regulations. In response to my opponent's argument of internal researchers, you can tag my response as internal researching based on insurance claims. They found those off of insurance claims, not a medical researcher or not a medical finding. They found those off of insurance claims when they were doing an audit. That has nothing to do with whether they really should have or should not have done a medical project on findings of an insurance claim. In response to my opponent's argument of open MRS, you can tag my response as no proof of OSI. Again, Judge, I asked my opponent in cross-examination, is there proof that they used a completely new type of program or innovated off of a new program such as Linux or created a new drug? And he couldn't provide any instance that they did actually innovate. So there's no proof to show that it is open source innovation. In response to my opponent's argument of can't access because of people having their patents, you can tag my response. In response to Pfizer, if we want to actually focus on Pfizer's patent on their own drug, they don't actually have a patent on that drug. It's a completely third-party company. They just have access to producing that drug. I'm not completely aware of which company it is, but I do know that that Embryo is not filed under Pfizer. It's filed under a completely different company. All they have is the access to produce or to research or to create new drugs such as Enbrel or other rheumatoid arthritis drugs. In response to my opponent's voting issue, I'm talking about focusing on life. You can tag my response as protection of intellectual property incentivizes life. Again, the whole system of protecting of intellectual property incentivizes the creation and the innovation of new products. So does that mean we're saving more lives for protection of intellectual property? In response to my opponent's argument of intellectual property destroys, you can tag my response again as the system is for incentivizing life. When we look at the practicality on how many medicals or how many medications are being created through protection of intellectual property, that is what's truly saving the lives of millions. And lastly, my opponent brought the argument of OSI promotes. You can tag my response as the choice. My opponent is arguing that we should force people to share the information. That's not all a forcing that we should be doing upon people. We should be valuing their choice on which side do they think is more important, which is why we should have the value of general welfare with the choice on which one do they want, which is my first voting issue. You can write that down as the choice. My second voting issue is practicality. Which side has more on net arguments to show which side promotes general welfare the most? My opponent has only brought in specific instances where the whole entire form of protection of intellectual property promotes general welfare. Thank you.
Okay, guys, you didn't make that easy for me. Thank you. Well done.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time.
Yeah. Y'all have a good.
Have a great rest of the tournament.
Thank you. Great job. Oh, okay.